The Pacific takes up 1/3 of the globe, and the many islands there are home to an incredibly diverse range of cultures. They range from people in Papua New Guinea, up in the highlands there, to urban places like Auckland, to communities where people are very self-sufficient and produce all their own food and so on. So a very wide range of different ways of living in the Pacific. There's also a wide range of landforms. So you have volcanic islands, like as you can see here, a high island, and many coral atolls as well, as you can also see here. Great diverse range of cultures with many different spiritual approaches to the world. You can see this is an example of some moai from the original religion that was in Rapa Nui at the time. There's many other different types of religion and different approaches to the world. The Pacific Islands have a great tradition of travelling great distances, and they've all encompassed huge distances on their canoes, taking with them a great sort of storage, a great settlement package, a survival package of different plants and animals with them to populate the islands that they landed on. Many of the things of the environment, things around them, are often incorporated into the things that people in the Pacific Islands have made over time. This is just an example of some bark cloth in our collection here at the museum, with fish and plants and so on it. Many very sort of responsive things that are made in the Pacific, things that are able to catch particular types of fish using a particular kind of net or fish traps like this one, which are all particularly designed to catch a particular fish in a particular time of year and a particular stage of its life cycle. There's very detailed knowledge of the way things are in the ocean in the Pacific, and that people can respond to that in a very detailed way and be able to catch things in the most effective way. There's you can see this is just a lovely ornament from a canoe with which features a fish and some tropic birds as well. The birds are leaning down. You can see these are all important parts of the ways that people link into their environment. Not only the things that they catch and eat, it's also often totemic animals. So a particular group might have the frigate bird or bonito as their totem, and those things have a very special, important part in their lives. So as we know, there's great voyaging traditions, and the sea is something which people have always had a lot of respect for in the Pacific, because it's the thing that sustains them in many ways, but it's also the thing that can end them. And the Pacific Ocean is increasingly the thing that's coming up to get them. And it's something that a Pacific Islander, a Samoan friend of mine who lives here in New York, said to me that the sea has always been rising up to get us. This is nothing new. And she also said that actually Pacific Islanders were the ones who started talking about climate change first. Whether that's true or not is by the by. What's interesting about that is that perception that as Pacific Islanders, they've been having to deal with climate change for a very long time, for many decades and many decades more than the rest of us have had to really deal with it, or start thinking about it, or start the conversation about it. So this is an image of Tuvalu. This is high tide. This is becoming increasingly common in Tuvalu. It's a very low-lying coral atoll, and it's flat, and there's nowhere to go when the tide comes crashing up over the beach. So in the Pacific, there's increasingly problems with salt water rising up, flooding, making it hard to grow crops because the ground is becoming saturated with salt water, either from being overwashed by the sea, or from the salt water bubbling up through the coral substrate of the atoll. This is increasingly happening. Also, there's a lot of erosion of the coastline. So here, this is a cemetery which is being washed away in Fiji. Many people are having to try and decide what to do about their ancestors. Do you move them inland? Do you actually try and do that, or do you just have to let them be reclaimed by the sea? It's a very, very difficult decision. There's also problems with freshwater. There's increasing amounts of drought and difficulty with being able to maintain freshwater reserves. Like wells like this are often having salt water coming into them, so it's increasingly difficult. And often there's just droughts that last for years. Very hard to get fresh water. Cyclones are becoming increasingly intense. So this is a cyclone that hit Samoa recently, which is incredibly devastating. In places like Fiji and some other islands around in that sort of part of the Pacific, there's been quite a lot of relocation happening already, and the government is able to fund the relocation. In a place like Fiji, you can see that the government has decided to just put sort of little green boxes on the hill, and I don't know whether they actually talk to the villagers about what sort of houses they might like, but I think this is what they've got, and it's probably, they don't have much choice about in the matter. So there's a lot of changes on all sorts of levels within the Pacific. And Pacific Islanders are pretty unanimous, I think, in wanting to make sure that the rest of the world knows that they're having incredibly difficult problems, and incredibly difficult challenges ahead of them, but also that they're not just victims, that they're doing what they can to make a difference to their own lives, and to make sure that they're not contributing to the emission of greenhouse gases, and that many islands have decided that they're going to be going carbon neutral by 2020. There's a lot of them who have decided they're going to be completely sustainable in terms of energy and all sorts of other measures that they're implementing. Replanting mangroves to protect their shorelines, all sorts of measures to reduce pollution and degradation of their environments. You can see here, this is Majuro. This is one of the main parts of the atoll in the Marshall Islands. You can see the landform here makes it pretty clear about why there's problems with rising sea levels. If you're living in a place like this, it makes it pretty difficult. You can also see why navigation is such an important part, and living with the sea in an effective way, and with things that really sum up how much people have been able to understand and read their environment, and how every little movement of the currents as they intersect, and each detail of the particular birds they see, and the scent that comes in the wind, and all these different things about their environment as they were travelling through it, are now becoming unpredictable and slightly unknown to them, and it's unsettling, and it means that the ability to predict the coming weather, which makes a huge difference on whether you're going to go and make a canoe voyage or not, whether you're going to be able to go out and fish in the way you'd like to, or when you're going to be able to fish next, is now becoming all unsettled, and they're not sure about their environment anymore. It's increasingly difficult to predict. Marshall Islanders are often having to think about moving, and that's one thing we talked about before with talking about them moving to Arkansas and other places around the world. But it's, at the moment, you can move and know that you can still come back home and visit everyone at home again. It's still at the stage where you don't have to say goodbye to home as yet, but they will know that there's this concept that maybe their islands won't be there anymore, and it's a very difficult thing if your whole culture is based in the land and grounded in the land, to then think about how you might have it not be there anymore is an extraordinary thing. And you might just think about yourselves. If you could no longer visit the land that's important to you, the places that are special to you, your home, if that was completely gone, if you couldn't ever come back to New York, if you could never come back to the place that you feel your family is rooted, how would you think about the ways that you might deal with that? It's something that we're all around the world going to have to deal with much more in the future. Here's one of those whale that it's built in that same traditional form, but uses modern European materials in it. And you can see that this is just after Cyclone Evan, and it's that particular whale has weathered quite well, but quite a lot of the houses didn't. And it's certainly something that people are having to think about much more, is what sort of building are we going to stick with as cyclones get more and more intense. I was involved in a project over this past year. We're just sort of starting to finish the project up, which was called Rethinking Home, Climate Change in New York and Samoa. And we were bringing two groups together, one in New York and one in Samoa, to talk about the impacts of severe weather on coastal communities and their connections to home, and their senses of identity and personal security. And this is just a really fascinating set of investigations about what sort of things actually are threatened for people when their homes are threatened, and thinking about how there's actually quite a lot of similarities between the sorts of things that people have felt after Hurricane Sandy as they did after Cyclone Evan. We've had workshops here and in Samoa, and people have come back and forth between the two places. We'll be having a book coming out of that project as well. So Pacific Islanders are increasingly reaching out to the rest of the world to try and get their message across, and they're using forums like YouTube and Flickr, as well as things like the UN forums on climate change and other more sort of governmental forums. Artists are increasingly expressing their concerns and anxieties, and the other thing that's happening is a lot of people in the Pacific are having many more debates and discussions about what they should do. They feel that, okay, no one else is helping us, we're going to have to help ourselves. What do we do to deal with these problems? And in the Marshall Islands, the main narrative there is self-blame. They feel that they're to blame because they've given up their traditional ways and taken on American ways. What they need to do is return to, going by canoe rather than having an outboard motor on your boat, returning to traditional foods rather than bringing in tinned foods, return to using sorts of power that they can produce themselves rather than using electricity and so on. So there's a lot of sense that I guess there's a way that they can try and control the changes in their environment by changing the way they are in the world and returning to traditional ways and giving up American ways. So it's quite sobering and humbling to think that the Marshall Islanders, who produce something like 0.0001 of greenhouse gas emissions, are feeling that they're to blame for climate change.